I was always told, never, when you're out and about, never do your second best speech. Never try anything new, always do your best speech. And my best speech is aimed very squarely at Key Stage 2, because I'm a children's author. So I'd like to ask you now to all sit up like big bunnies and give me your big listening ears. It's going to be great. And when my best speech is introduced by a teacher, they always mention this book that I wrote, a book that's a sort of minor modern classic called Millions. And when the teacher mentions that, the kids all go absolutely mental for about 5 minutes. And that's because when the teacher said millions, the kids heard this. So I have to calm everybody down again. And then the teacher's sort of always a little bit embarrassed and tries to sort of build me up again and mentions what Fiona's just mentioned, the Olympic opening ceremony. And it's Key Stage 2. And this is the Olympic opening ceremony for 2012. So they were born in 2013. So they have no memory of this. And in fact, the country it depicts is now as irrecoverable as Atlantis. You go through this, they're kind of like, I don't know who that is. And this now gets some recognition, but by the time my next book comes out, they will have to explain who that lady on the left is. Wait, oh. Let's try to keep it light. So my best speech always starts in an atmosphere of, well, let's go through. Crushing disappointment, mild bewilderment, sort of temporary, moderate interest. And so I think I can reproduce those elements this afternoon, because I know nothing about marketing. I'm a children's writer. Marketing in children's fiction comes down to, are you David Walliams? No. Do you know David Walliams? A little bit. Can you get him to blurb your book? Comedy genius strikes again. That's what he said about my last book. That's the first bit of marketing I've ever done in my life. So, and you can see how embarrassed I was about that. So I'm here because Shona McCarthy asked me to be here. And she didn't tell me, she just said, do you want to do the Ogilvy lecture? And being a good Catholic, I assumed that the Ogilvy lecture was a celebration of the life of St. John Ogilvy, the 17th century Jesuit martyr. So, come back with me, if you will, to the Reformation and to John Calvin. So I've had to do quite a lot of kind of reading up on the actual Ogilvy. And I found a quote. I found a quote that you were right. There's always a quote. Because at the end of my best speech, there's always a section where children are allowed to ask questions. And those questions are, do you know David Walliams? And then there's, where'd you get your ideas from? And there's a David Ogilvy quote about where ideas come from. He says, ideas come from, I think it's experimental groping. Yeah. Experimental groping provoked by hunches, inspired by the subconscious. So I'm definitely going to use that when I'm at St. John Ogilvy Primary Library reopening. That's the answer I'm going to give. I also looked at Rory Sutherland's famous TED Talk, a really good TED Talk. He gave a really brilliant TED Talk. You can't say that about many people. And it's the TED Talk that you've probably seen, where he talks about remarketing shreddies, which are square, as diamonds. Yeah. It's really, really funny, and it ends with people being kind of unsure whether the diamond is as good as the square, so they release a combo pack. And he ends with this really powerful plea. And I've seen this talk years and years ago and sort of forgotten I'd seen it. It ends with this very powerful plea. He ends with a quotation from Rilke and another quotation from G.K. Chesterton. And his quotation from Rilke is about how poetry can make the familiar unfamiliar and make it strange and beautiful again. And the quotation from Chesterton is, well, the talk is about how you guys can add value to what we already have. That it's not just about getting more stuff, it's about finding wonder and reawakening the magic in what's already here. It's a really, really powerful talk, and he ties it with environmentalism, and it feels like a real mission. And he ends with a quotation from Chesterton, which is, the world is not perishing for lack of wonders, the world is perishing for lack of wonder. And when Rory quoted that, and definitely when Chesterton wrote that, I kind of think that the word perishing was a rhetorical flourish, But this summer, I don't think any of us can deny the fact that it is highly possible that the world, in terms of our ability to live in it, is actually perishing. And that it is precisely because we have forgot to wonder. We have lost that sense of wonder. We have forgot to marvel at the fact that we're alive at all. That the odds against life are so stacked and so fragile. And it's become a very, very, very urgent idea. So when I watched that talk, first watched that talk, I had forgotten about this, that when I first watched that talk, it sent me racing back to Chesterton, and I read that book, Orthodoxy, and I've tried to live by that quotation in my professional life. That's been my creative motto, is to reawaken wonder. That's what I've seen as my mission. And I'd completely forgotten this till I was, but this, where's it gone? Okay, this, when we were working on this, we had that quotation from Chesterton on the wall, as I've just lost sound. Yeah. When we were working on this, we had that quotation from Chesterton on the wall, and this, the Olympic opening ceremony, was actually called Isles of Wonder. So I'm here to sort of say thank you to Rory Sutherland for waking that up in me and for sending me back to that idea. And that's been my guiding idea for a long time now. So this is what it's about. It's about reawakening wonder, and there's loads of ways to do that. We've seen some of them, we've been talking about them. You can do all kinds of things. You can do fancy camera angles and drone shots. But I'm here today to talk about comedy and laughter as a way of reawakening wonder. So because I was out of my depth, because it's not about St. John Ogilvy, which I would be so comfortable talking about, I really did the work. And I went away and I read Darwin. I read Darwin's The Expression of Emotion in Human and Animals. Which is a great book, and it's a really easy read. It's a lovely book. It's a book that basically comes down to Darwin saying, I think my dog can understand everything that I say. And he's noodling around looking for what is human, what's animal, what's universal, what's cultural. So for instance, weeping, weeping is universal, but it's incredibly culturally inflected. We weep in different ways for different things in different parts of the world. Blushing, he thinks is irreducibly human. Animals, he thinks, don't blush. But animals do express amusement, and there's a lovely section about going to London Zoo and trying to amuse animals, which is what he did. And he says they shine, their eyes shine. And if you want a really great example of that, if you look on YouTube for Robin Williams and Coco, which is K-O-K-O, someone's nodding, you've not wasted your life. There you go. This is a clip of Robin Williams. I'm not going to show it. This is a clip of Robin Williams, the comedian, tickling a gorilla. And the gorilla visibly is laughing and laughs so much in the end that has to reciprocate and lifts Robin Williams' t-shirt and twiddles his nipples. I forgot what that's an amazing book, The Expression of Emotion in Human Animals. It's incredibly neglected. No, it's not neglected. Why have I said that? It's a book that is cited really, really widely in studies about fear, in studies about sexuality, in studies about taboo. But there's very, very few citations of it in studies of humour. There are very, very few studies of humour. We don't really study laughter. And one of the few people who studied and talks at length and brilliantly about laughter is a woman, a neurologist called Sophie Scott, and I really, really recommend her Royal Society lecture about the nature of laughter and how it works and what laughter is, which takes her cue from Darwin's book. And one of the things she does in that talk is she shows you brain mapping of people talking, and when we're talking, our brains are completely lit up. It's like Blackpool illuminations inside your head. But when we laugh, it sort of all closes down. Laughter is actually a really basic activity. It's just mostly muscular. And so she talks about this sort of tug between talking and listening, which are the most cerebral things that we do, and this completely basic physical thing that Coco the gorilla can do. And the paradox of how strange it is that it takes this incredibly cerebral thing, putting something clever to do with words, to release this very, very basic animal thing. And I think one of the reasons that people haven't written a lot about laughter is that laughter is mysterious. It's really, really hard to pin down why we laugh. So for instance, you all just laughed when I said Coco twiddled Robin Williams' nipples. But if I had said it caressed Robin Williams' chest, it's not funny, is it? And why is that funny? Why is that funny? Why, it's really, really hard to sort out why that is funny. It's a mystery, and you just have to do experimental groping. You have to just experimentally grope to find out what the funny version of that is. There's an incredible precision about humour. Tiny bit off and it's just not funny. Dead right and it's funny forever. I always think about P.G. Woodhouse's description of Bertie Wooster waking up with a hangover. A cat stamped into the room. There's nothing show-offy about it. It's just incredibly precise and correct. And we had this great evening. My wife and I went out to dinner. We had dinner with Ken Dodd. And at some point, Denise mentioned that we had seven children. And Doddy said, by Jove, missus. Of course he said that. By Jove, missus. 7 children. Stand up and take a bow. No, sit down, take a rest. He's so quick, so relentless. And what is he doing? That he's playing with language all the time. All the time, Doddy was playing with language. It's the most sort of cerebral thing that you could possibly do, experimenting with language. From simple puns like, by Jove, what a great day for opening your shirt, pouring a lot of ice cubes down your front and saying, how's this for a chest freezer? And it would go on like this. They were long. His act was very long. I don't know if people are even aware of this anymore. His act was incredibly long. He used to come on and say, before he began, he would say, I hope you bought your sandwiches. This is going, or your sleeping bag, this is going on all night. People would get up to leave because they had the last bus to catch, and he would shout, that's not going to do any good, I'm going to follow you home and shout through the letterbox. And by the end, it was kind of nearly gibberish. It would kind of gone from those nice little puns about chest freezers to what a great day for stuffing your tights with ice cream, standing on your head and saying, how's this for a Knickerbocker glory? It's like, it's not even making any sense. But you were in the audience, and it was exactly what Fiona was describing, this incredible togetherness, that the entire audience has sort of become one big laughing organism. I was going back to the precision. He kept notes. Doddy performed nearly every night. If he didn't have a show, he would do a charity show. He was completely sort of addicted to this and to getting this response. Every single night, after every single show, till he was 90, he would make a review. He would write a review of his own show in the third person and note that some words are funnier in some parts of the country than in others, and he would make a map of that. It's incredible. What you've just said. Swede is funny, turnip's not funny. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so it's there. So going back to Sophie Scott, what was I saying about this? So Sophie Scott, the neurologist, she talks about whether laughter has some kind of evolutionary value in our story. And I don't want to think about where she got this information, because it's grim, okay? But she posits that laughter is a kind of opening, a kind of openness that declares that you're harmless. And her experimental proof of this is that rats laugh. Rats have a vocal register that expresses amusement, so it is a laugh. If you devocalize rats, when rats play, rats who've been devocalized and can't make that laughing noise, they get bitten. Right? They get bitten by other rats. So that, whereas blushing is a kind of involuntary signal of vulnerability, laughter is a kind of more or less voluntary signal that you are harmless, that you're open. And that experience that you described, Fiona, of people being together, I think that's the power of laughter, is when it is powerful, when you're in that Ken Dodd audience where you're just reduced to this animal pulsing laughter, is a sense of profound connection that cuts across disagreements and cultural differences. Because laughter is universal in that sense. I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about laughter is that involuntary aspect of it, that in every culture we laugh the same way. We don't cry the same way in every culture. We don't love the same way in every culture. We laugh the same way in every culture. And in every culture, laughter can erupt involuntarily. It can disrupt the most sacred, the most arcane, the most important ceremony can be disrupted by somebody having a fit of the giggles. Yeah? So it's that sense of profound connection, and that is its power. And I keep seeing sort of talks about this as though, there's a well-being aspect to this. It's really good if you laugh and you feel connected to people. That is not how we laugh. That's not why we laugh. We laugh because something's funny. We don't laugh for our well-being. We don't have sex in order to make the bed springs more durable. we have sex because we love somebody and they make us laugh, maybe. So where was I going with this? I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm just completely distracting myself now. Yeah, I wanted to take a moment to say that doesn't mean laughter is necessarily benign. Because we're talking about why not funny, and why not funny might be hesitancy as well about who to offend. Laughter is not necessarily benign. Laughter is an incredibly powerful tool. That doesn't mean it's always good. There's nothing worse than being laughed at. There's no more powerful way of ostracizing a group than laughing at them. Through the 1980s, the whole comedy scene was convulsed by who it's all right to laugh at and who it's not all right to laugh at. You can't punch up, you can't punch down. And at the moment, children's publishing is also full of you can't make that joke. Sometimes rightly, sometimes debatably. But there's a debate about who you can laugh at and who you can't laugh at. Laughing is not necessarily good. But what I want to come back to is Rory's theme, that it is always that I don't want this to be a philosophical thing, I want it to be a really practical thing. So I want to recommend laughter to you as a way of doing what Rory Sutherland suggested, which is to give back the magic to objects, to what we already have. And to use that sense of connection for that. Because I love that moment of connection, and I'm always looking for it. And Shona's here. Shona and I worked on a huge event in Derry in 2013, in which the centrepiece of what I worked on was bringing this enormous Loch Ness monster down Loch Foyle. And thinking, just the day before, having nearly killed ourselves to build this huge, it was huge. It's like the biggest puppet that's ever been made or something. Bringing down the phone thinking, oh, right, so there's a mile of people looking at this. So they're going to see it incrementally. It's not really going to feel like an event. It's going to feel like, I've seen that, and walk off. And thinking, we have to make this a moment, because the key thing is that moment when everybody's looking the same way. That's the connection. And just a few days before, thinking, we need that storytelling moment. And we rang an actor, Jimmy Nesbitt, whose voice would have been recognisable to everybody there, and wrote just 2 or 3 lines and broadcast them as the monster first came into view. And I remember being on the top floor of a multi-storey car park, looking down at the bank of the Foyle where these thousands of people were, and seeing the moment when a crowd became an audience. It was just an incredible thing, just this, like a wildlife documentary, just like there was milling around, suddenly everybody was looking the same way, and suddenly it became an event. And that happens on a tiny scale. I'm going to tell you about, I remember taking my grandson, Patrick, to school, and all his mates had phones and they were scrolling. So they were all in their separate worlds. And Patrick wasn't allowed a phone, so he took his little black Sharpie pen from me, because I'm always carrying one in case you want me to sign your book. And he did that thing of stuffing it up his nose and then bringing it out of his mouth again, which is a really, really basic trick. And his mates were like, what did you just do? This amazing thing where this very, very banal object became a centre of attention, and that shared attention being that moment of connection. And I want this to be practical, so I'm thinking about how this works. How does it work? So one of the things that I think I've isolated about what makes something really funny is surprise. And by surprise, I don't mean novelty. I don't mean suddenly getting a unicorn to walk through the door. I mean that whole thing of taking something familiar and making making it new. So there's nothing special or fancy about the word stamped, but when a cat stamped into the room, suddenly it became amazing. And I'm going to give you a really silly example of this. Well, maybe it's not silly, maybe it's really telling. In With Nail and I, there's a moment where they're stopped by the police for being drunk. And With Nail tries to sort of flannel the policeman by saying, "But officer, I've only had a few ales." And that's a really funny, I love that line. I think it's really, really funny because of I think it's because of the unexpected archaism of saying a few ales as opposed to beers, you know, and also, why is that an excuse? You know, I've only had a few ales. And it's a really, really funny line. But a few months ago, I saw Alan Carr being interviewed. And he had a very similar story being told that he was drunk. And a line that was the same shape. He said, "But I've only had a Rubicon." And that's balloon-burstingly funny. And it's balloon-burstingly funny because what the hell is Rubicon? You know, who notices Rubicon? It's that thing of like, I've noticed Rubicon. Nobody goes to buy a Rubicon. You get a Rubicon because you're in the garage and you don't want to, do you know what I mean? You don't want a Coke. It's like, it's just a kind of neglected item. Like you don't deliberately, nobody says, "Oh, I love Rubicon," you know, it's like, but you buy it if there's nothing else there. And that surprise of moving that to the center stage, and maybe that's a good definition of surprise. Surprise being the mechanism that takes something familiar and reminds you that it's astounding. Which is what brings me to, it's still there, this, okay. Not that Britain is a kind of Rubicon, but in the weeks before we did this, everybody, and this is forgotten now, the whole thing's forgotten now, but everybody thought it was going to be rubbish. This is sort of forgotten now, and it was really, really hard. You know, we were rehearsing people in the rain in Dagenham who were voluntary, we were all voluntary, and the papers were full of how dreadful, dreadful, dreadful this was going to be. I will never forget a letter in the Daily Mail. It's the only time I've ever read the Daily Mail. And it said, "This is going to be a disgrace, we're going to be the laughingstock of the world. I'm so glad it's happening in London, signed Paul from Leeds." But everybody thought it was going to be rubbish. And why did they think it was going to be rubbish? Because people were carrying around this really emaciated view of who we were and what our history was. And it was basically 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup. That was it, you know. So, and this was true to the highest level, because we had meetings with government ministers, we had meetings with Boris Johnson, who was the Mayor of London at the time, and they were very cynical about it. You know, Johnson's notes was, "There needs to be more Shakespeare." It's based on The Tempest, Boris, and starts with Caliban's speech. And there needs to be more Churchill in it. Okay, let's not go there. But you know, he was like someone who became Prime Minister, also carrying around this 2 World Wars, 1 World Cup view of what our history was. Like the nation had completely forgotten that Britain did an industrial revolution. They'd forgotten, you know, all the glorious things that had come up in this ceremony, the Windrush, and also did not understand its own magic. Because one of the things that we got most stick for was that halfway through there's a section about pop music that starts with what looks like a Barrett home on the stage, you know, an ordinary semi-detached. Oh my God, you have no idea how hard we had to defend that. Because that is pathetic. That house that most people live in is pathetic. And I remember having to make this big case that house, the bedrooms in that house, are where all the creativity comes from. Those bedrooms are where the dreams are dreamed. Those bedrooms are where the Beatles come from, the Stones come from, every game comes from. All the people in those bedrooms, if you don't understand the magic of those bedrooms, you don't understand anything. And representing it as a magical space was really, really important to us. I remember the Archers music playing over it as they came in. Yeah, so why have I said that? Okay. And I'm not calling the Queen a kind of Rubicon either, but this bit, that idea of putting the real monarch with a fictional character is, to me, very like the cat stamps into the room. you know? It's a new sentence that represents something that's very, I'm not saying she's a kind of Rubicon, but she was very familiar by this point. Everybody knew who she was. And presenting something that is long known in a new light. Seems that's what worked. This was something we filmed long before the ceremony, so this was something that we knew was going to work. And so that was our ace up the sleeve. Let me tell you, I'll go back a bit. And we filmed, this came out, I'm going to tell you how this came about. We didn't expect the Queen to want to be in the opening ceremony. We'd written this sketch and we had actually cast an actress to look like the Queen. And our producer, Tracy Seward, went to a meeting in Buckingham Palace, which she told us would be boring and we didn't need to go to. And at the meeting was the Queen's dresser, because what we wanted to know was what the Queen would be wearing on the day, so that our actress could wear the same thing, and also to see, could we have permission to represent the monarch in this comedy way. And she took the meeting and Tracy said, and we want to take photographs of this part of the palace so that we can reproduce it. And the Queen's dresser, Angela, who is also a Scouser, said, why do you want to do that? And she went, well, so that we can build something that looks authentic like the palace. And she went, well, you've got to shoot it here. And she was like, well, that would be nice. Yeah, because she's not going to go somewhere else. And Tracy went, who? You know, the Queen. She went, we didn't want her to be in it. So I wouldn't mention that if I were you. Very, very keen. She's very, very keen. So we ended up with this amazing ace in the hole of the actual monarch in an actual sketch. And talking about connection around the world, this was an amazing moment. You know, I got an email from a friend in New York. It was a hot night in New York, and the window of his flat was open. And at the moment she turns around, and it's her, and this comedy is about timing, so there's an amazing piece of timing in it, where she turns around and you go, oh my God, it's the Queen. This huge cheer rang out over Greenwich Village. Like, that's mad, isn't it? Yeah, so this was, so we knew that was going to happen. And Danny Boyle called it the surprise. And there was a lot of talk about how to protect the surprise. There was a lot of like, we've got to get people to sign NDAs, and we've got to confiscate people's phones and blah, blah, blah. And Danny said, well, I think what we'll actually do is just ask people nicely, and we'll call it the surprise and say, keep the surprise. And that really, really worked. Except somehow the Sun did get hold of this. And I got a phone call a few months before the ceremony from Stephen Daldry, who was our director, saying, have you seen the Sun? And I said, well, mate, I live in Liverpool. It's not really going to happen. And he said, well, get on the website, I'll send you a link. And they had it. They had the whole thing. They had the photograph and the helicopter and everything. And we were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? You're going to tell Danny? I know you have to tell Danny. It was Sunday morning. I went, well, I'm going to Mass, so you can deal with it. And when I came back, the phone rang again, and Stephen said, look again, refresh the website. And the Sun had run with that story on April Fool's Day. So the one time in its history that it told the truth. So, yeah, so you take something familiar and you do something with it, and it becomes something different. So you take the pen, you stuff it up. Oh, I've done that wrong. Leave that, forget that. Forget it. We're going to do what Patrick learned to do. He showed me how to do this. You go, you stuff it up your nose, but when you bring it down, it's a different colour. It's green because it's been in your nose. It changes. Yeah. I got very interested in magic a few months before my mum died. We had a birthday party for her in our back garden. It was during all that stuff when everything had to be outdoors. We had a birthday party for her in the back garden, and I hired a magician to come. I think people can be cynical about magicians until you actually see some magic, and he did close-up magic for her. And my mum had been looking after my dad who had dementia for a very long time. Which he'd been bedridden for about 5 years, so that was really tough. But he'd obviously had dementia a long time before that, and she sort of protected him from it. So she had all the cares of the world on her shoulders. And I saw him do this magic, this with pens and ordinary household objects. And I saw all that just drop from her face for a few minutes, and she was like a little child. And going back to the Rory Sutherland thing, we must be as little children. We must be as little children. That's from the gospel, and it always sounds like a nice commandment, but as we get nearer this perishing, it seems like an absolute imperative. Because what are little children? They are curiosity machines. They're interested in everything, attention machines. And that magic comes from attention. So I have the huge privilege every now and then of walking my youngest granddaughter to primary school. She's interested in absolutely everything except traffic and except getting to school. She's really, really interested in that dead seagull that's been there for 3 days now. And don't seagulls bury their dead? She's very interested in the little plastic pipe that comes out of the laundry part of the retirement home, which spews out hot, pertily air into... That's unbelievably riveting. We cannot wait to get to that, to see if it's on or off. We must be as little children. So, because attention is the beginning of wonder. Wonder is the beginning of gratitude. Gratitude is the beginning of devotion. You might not want to follow me through all those steps, but I should suggest that you begin the journey, because you can be part of this. That Rory Sutherland thing, the world is not perishing for lack of wonders. The world is perishing for lack of wonder. It really is. And you have a part to play in rekindling that wonder. Thank you very much.